Welcome to Courtside, everyone. What used to be a discussion of the post-election litigation brought by Donald Trump, and now is morphing into something else, driven by Donald Trump's resistance to reality, fact, the Constitution, honesty, decency, and respect for anyone besides himself. It's day 68. There is no more litigation really to be had. The big litigation is elsewhere, that Donald Trump is threatening to sue Twitter for booting him, claiming it violates the First Amendment. I guess it looks like he has Jenna Ellis and Rudy Giuliani advising him on this, since everyone who's actually gone to one day of law school with their eyes open knows that the First Amendment only binds government actors, not private companies. I can't violate the First Amendment, and neither can you. Strict constructionist, my heavens. Here's the language of the First Amendment. Quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Congress, not Twitter is not Congress, Mr. Trump, and that's fortunate for Twitter because otherwise I suppose Donald Trump would order folks to attack it. On the other side, there is something to bemoan here about Donald Trump getting kicked off of Twitter. I mean, for all of its faults, Trump's Twitter account provided the public more access than we've had to the daily musings of any president. Now I guess we're going to actually have to watch Fox and Friends to find out what Donald Trump is thinking. Anyway, Trump now has a lifetime ban from Twitter, rendering his iPhone just about as useful as Josh Hawley's law degree. Oh, and by the way, Trump also got banned from Spotify, which spares us seeing the only 2020 Wrapped feature that has Kid Rock and Ted Nugent as the most played artists. The big news here is impeachment, and that is moving fast. The House of Representatives is going to introduce it tomorrow, it looks like, and support for impeachment is building fast. Indeed, the new article of impeachment has about 200 more signatories than Donald Trump has Twitter followers. After the House votes, which looks like it'll be around Wednesday, it's going to then go to the Senate, and it's not clear exactly what's going to happen at that point. Senator Mitch McConnell said that the Senate is in recess so that they're just too busy on their vacation to get around to doing anything until January 19th. This is the same dude who rammed a Supreme Court nominee through 8 days before a presidential election and in record time to fill that historic seat by Justice Ginsburg. There's also some new news over the weekend about Trump's interference with the election. And the question I think Congress is facing now is whether to include that as part of the impeachment articles or just go with the straightforward coup. And the news is really two things. One, Donald Trump fired the federal prosecutor in Atlanta earlier this week because the federal prosecutor evidently was refusing to make up election fraud cases that would have helped Donald Trump right before Congress met. It was also revealed that Trump made yet a third call trying to pressure Georgia state officials to change the election count. So I guess Kayleigh McEnany proved us wrong, and she finally actually told the truth for once. Donald Trump really had been making many calls and having many meetings. I just wish he included the part about Donald Trump breaking federal law in those calls. So we're now up to 3 calls between Trump and the Georgia officials. But really, folks, it's the Democrats who are undermining our ability to move on from the election by pursuing impeachment. And speaking of that, we had, that noted constitutional scholar today take to the airwaves, Representative Jim Jordan, and he said, most importantly, it's not healthy for the nation. I'm very concerned about where we are. I hope that we can begin to come back together. Oh my God, listening to Jim Jordan talk about national divisiveness is like asking David Duke to run your implicit bias training. I mean, I guess we could have consulted Senator Joe McCarthy on how to rebuild the First Amendment in the 1950s, but isn't he kind of like the last guy? Like really the last guy? These people have forfeited their right to talk about unity. They just spent the last 2 months, and I've cataloged it every day with you. We got the receipts. These guys have been saying Trump won the election, and they wanted to throw it all out and give Mike Pence the ability to decide it. One guy throwing out, tens of millions of votes. This is ridiculous. Okay, tonight I want to do one thing, which is a deep dive on impeachment. And what I'm going to do is give you the whole history of impeachment in a few minutes. And if you're interested, my book, it has this in much more detail, but here you go. So the story starts with the Declaration of Independence. And, today we think about it, the Declaration, really about its opening lines, about all men being created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And school children, of course, memorize those paragraphs, and politicians wax poetically about them. But few people, I think, can tell you what actually happens right after those words in the Declaration. Because actually, after all that soaring rhetoric, the Declaration goes into a list of, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations caused by King George III. The first one is pretty haunting. Quote, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And then there are 26 more offenses, such as, quote, obstructing the administration of justice and, quote, refusing others to be elected. In this way, you could think about the Declaration of Independence as really America's first articles of impeachment. And when it came time for our founders to think about a constitution of our own, one of their central objectives was making sure that we would never have anyone like King George again. As Benjamin Franklin said, referring to George Washington, quote, the first man put at the helm will be a good one, but nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will always be increasing here, as elsewhere, till it ends in a monarchy. Those are Franklin's haunting words. And that belief, shared among our founders, is the reason why our Constitution has so many different checks and balances, from separating Congress from the executive branch to separating Congress into two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Congress. They wanted to create what James Madison called a, quote, double security, dividing power, both separating it among the three branches of government, and then also federal government versus state. And every one of these checks and balances was designed really to prevent America from devolving into that monarchical government that we attacked in the Declaration of Independence. But in the summer of 1787, when our founders met in Philadelphia, I think they recognized that even these checks were not enough. They wanted some other tool to render presidents removable and accountable, and that was impeachment. So the Constitutional Convention began in May, but they didn't actually focus on impeachment until July 20th. And on that hot summer day, two of the convention's delegates, Charles Pinckney and Gouverneur Morris, laid out the case against Congress having the power to remove a president. They basically said, look, why don't we just have him run for election? And isn't that a sufficient check? Why would you ever want to preempt the will of the people? George Mason then responded vigorously, and he said, quote, shall any man be above justice? Above all, shall that man be above it, who can commit the most extensive injustice? Shall the man who has practiced corruption, and by that means procured his appointment as president in the first instance, be suffered to escape punishment by repeating his guilt? In other words, Mason was saying, without the protection of impeachment, what's to stop a president from committing crimes to win office? Particularly if he knows he'll have a get-out-of-jail-free card afterwards. And Mason was, actually had support on this from James Madison, who was, of course, the chief architect of the Constitution. He said the president, quote, might lose his capacity after his appointment. He might pervert his administration into a scheme of embezzlement or oppression. That Madison guy is prophetic. And get this, here's even more prophetic. William Richardson Davie from North Carolina in Philadelphia makes a similar point, warning that an unimpeachable president might just, quote, spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself reelected. Spare no effort to get himself reelected. And that's, of course, what exactly Trump tried to do here, which is why I quoted that in my New York Times op-ed last week. So the convention quickly settled on the need for impeachment and for a process. They said the House of Representatives is to investigate and to pass what we call articles of impeachment. And they do so by a majority vote. And then that gets sent to the Senate. And the Senate the Senate could only convict if 2/3 of the members would say that he should be convicted. And that's very similar in a way to criminal courts, in which you have a high bar for conviction and a much higher bar than the bar for indictment, the grand jury stage. And so the division of powers our founders felt was important because the two halves of the legislature were designed to work differently from one another. The House was supposed to be more directly related to the people, and the Senate was different because, after all, the Senate was supposed to represent states. And some of you know this, but before the 17th Amendment was ratified, senators were actually selected by state legislators, not the people. So that in 1913, we changed that with the 17th Amendment. Now, the founders' approach to impeachment was very different from Britain. In Britain, Parliament could only impeach the king's ministers, but here, we decided that the vice president could be impeached and all civil officers of the United States. Yes, that means any cabinet official or anything like that. It doesn't actually include members of Congress. And Donald Trump used to tweet like impeach Mitt Romney and stuff like that, again, betraying his absolute ignorance of the Constitution. You can't impeach a member of Congress, but you can impeach a president, as Donald Trump is about to find out yet again. So basically, you had the founders deciding that here's the mechanism for impeachment, but there was still one important thing that they hadn't answered. What was going to qualify as an impeachable offense? So in early drafts of the Constitution, some had proposed malpractice or neglect of duty and said, look, if you neglect your duty, that's enough. But there was a concern about that, and so they kicked it to what they called the Committee on Postponed Matters. So they took that up at the very end of the Constitution. And in that time, they basically said, there were a bunch of different standards. George Mason said the standard should be, quote, treason, bribery, and maladministration. Madison said, no, maladministration is too broad. That could make the president more like a prime minister, subject to votes by the legislature to recall him at any point. He said, quote, maladministration should be replaced with high crimes and misdemeanors against the state, which is a phrase borrowed from the English Parliament. And that is really the standard now, treason, bribery, or other high crime and misdemeanor. And we know that, what is a high crime and misdemeanor? One thing we know, it doesn't necessarily mean a crime, even a serious crime. And we know this for many reasons, but the most important reason is that our founders literally allowed the vice president, Aaron Burr, to get away with murder. And in case you've been living under a rock and haven't, seen Hamilton or read about it or something, here's what happens. Aaron Burr is the vice president of the United States, and he goes and shoots and kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel. And yet Congress decides not to impeach him. And the reason was because they didn't see it as a crime against the state. They saw it as an ordinary crime, and obviously a serious one, but not one that is a betrayal of the public trust. And so that is really, when you think about what an impeachable offense is, it is a betrayal of the public trust. It's an abuse of power. And that, my friends, is exactly what we have here and what we've been talking about with Donald Trump's actions over the last 2 months. And I think I'm going to stop the story here for tonight, and tomorrow we can take up how the impeachment process works, whether a president can pardon himself from impeachment, and whether a former president can be impeached. So I'll see you tomorrow.